On the surface, Emily Stevens had it all: a loving husband, a beautiful home in the quiet town of Willow Creek, and a reputation as a devoted wife and mother. At 32, she had been married to Mark Stevens for nearly a decade. Mark was a successful software engineer, known for his steady demeanor and devotion to his family. The couple had 2 young children, and their life seemed like the picture of suburban bliss. But beneath the veneer of perfection, Emily was hiding a secret that would soon tear their world apart. Emily had always been the more ambitious and restless of the two. While Mark was content with their quiet life, Emily yearned for excitement and intellectual stimulation. She had put her career on hold to raise their children, but had recently decided to return to college to finish her degree in literature. It was there, in the ivy-covered halls of Willow Creek Community College, that she met Dr. Michael Adler. Dr. Adler was everything Mark was not: charismatic, passionate, and deeply engaged in his work. He was well known on campus, not just for his academic prowess, but also for his charm and good looks. He was in his early 40s, recently divorced, and his lectures were always packed with students eager to hear his perspectives on the great literary works. Emily was captivated from the first class. What began as admiration quickly turned into a dangerous attraction. Dr. Adler, noticing Emily's keen interest and insightful contributions in class, invited her to join a small study group he held at his home once a week. This was where their relationship truly began. The study group soon dissolved, leaving just Emily and Dr. Adler in his cozy, book-filled living room, discussing literature late into the night over glasses of wine. Their conversations were electric, filled with intellectual sparring and subtle flirtation. Emily found herself drawn to Michael in a way she hadn't felt in years. He made her feel alive, appreciated, and most importantly, desired. It didn't take long for their connection to cross the line. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion on forbidden love in literature, they found themselves entangled in a passionate kiss. That kiss led to a full-blown affair, conducted in secret behind the thick curtains of Michael's secluded home. Emily knew it was wrong. She knew she was risking everything for this forbidden passion, but she couldn't help herself. Michael was intoxicating, and for the first time in years, she felt truly alive. Their meetings became more frequent, and their love grew more intense, but so did the danger. Emily started to become careless. She would return home late, her excuses flimsy and unconvincing. Mark, though trusting and busy with his demanding job, began to notice the changes in his wife. She was distracted, often lost in thought, and their once regular conversations had dwindled to strained small talk. He asked her if everything was all right, and she would brush off his concerns, blaming stress from school. The tension at home grew, but Emily couldn't bring herself to end the affair. She was in too deep. The thrill of being with Michael was too addictive, the secrecy too exhilarating, but she was unaware that the very thing she thought brought her to life would soon lead to tragedy. Then, on the night of May 15th, everything changed. Emily and Michael had planned to meet at his house, as usual, after her evening class. It was supposed to be just another night of stolen moments, but when Emily arrived, she found Michael in a state of panic. His ex-wife had called, threatening to expose their affair to the college administration, claiming she had proof of their inappropriate relationship. The news hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She had always feared getting caught, but this was something else entirely. If the affair were exposed, it would ruin not only her marriage, but also Michael's career and reputation. In a moment of desperation, they concocted a plan to confront his ex-wife and plead with her to stay silent. They decided to drive to her house that night, hoping to resolve the situation before it spiraled out of control. As they sped through the quiet streets, Emily's mind was racing with thoughts of what she stood to lose. She was on the brink of a complete breakdown, but Michael assured her that everything would be fine. They arrived at the house just after midnight. The confrontation that ensued was explosive. Michael's ex-wife, Sandra, refused to back down. She was furious and hurt, accusing Emily of destroying her marriage. Emily tried to calm her down, but things quickly escalated. In the heat of the argument, Michael snapped. He grabbed a heavy candlestick from a nearby table and, in a fit of rage, struck Sandra on the head. She fell to the floor, blood pooling beneath her. Emily screamed, the reality of what had just happened crashing down on her like a tidal wave. Michael stood frozen, staring at the lifeless body of his ex-wife. The woman he had once loved, the mother of his child, now lay dead at his feet. The gravity of what he had done seemed to paralyze him. Emily, shaking with fear and adrenaline, grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the door. "We have to go now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. They fled the scene, leaving Sandra's body behind in the dark, empty house. As they drove away, the shock and horror of what had just transpired began to sink in. Emily knew there was no going back now. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The drive back to Willow Creek was silent, save for the sound of Emily's ragged breathing and Michael's knuckles turning white as he gripped the steering wheel. They both knew the enormity of what had just happened. They had crossed the ultimate line, and there was no turning back. They arrived at Michael's house just before dawn. Emily's mind was racing, her thoughts tangled in a web of fear and regret. How had everything spiraled so quickly? Just hours ago, they were lovers caught in a forbidden romance, and now they were accomplices in a murder. Michael, still reeling from what he had done, poured himself a drink, his hands shaking. "We need to think. We need a plan," he muttered, more to himself than to Emily. Emily's body felt numb. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in, and with it came a crushing sense of panic. She had to pull herself together. If they didn't act quickly, it would only be a matter of time before the police came knocking. "Michael, we have to get rid of the evidence. They'll find out it was us," she whispered, her voice breaking. He looked at her, eyes wide with desperation. "What do we do?" Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. "First, we need to establish an alibi. We have to make sure we were seen somewhere else tonight, somewhere public." They decided to head to a late-night diner on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place frequented by truckers and night shift workers, and they hoped it would be busy enough that someone would remember seeing them. They spent an agonizing hour there, making small talk and trying to act normal as they sipped on stale coffee. Emily's heart pounded in her chest every time the door opened, fearing that the police would burst in at any moment. After what felt like an eternity, they left the diner and drove back to their respective homes, praying that their makeshift alibi would hold up. But the dread in Emily's stomach didn't subside. She knew that they hadn't covered all their tracks. Sandra's body was still lying in that house, and it was only a matter of time before someone found her. The next morning, the news broke. Sandra Adler's body had been discovered by a neighbor who had heard a loud argument and came to check on her. The news spread like wildfire through the small community. A woman murdered in her own home. People were horrified and speculated wildly about what could have happened. Emily was at home when she heard the news. Her hands trembled as she watched the report on television, the bright yellow crime scene tape flashing on the screen. She felt as if she was watching a nightmare unfold in real time. She knew she had to act normal, but it was nearly impossible. Every time her phone rang, her heart leapt into her throat, expecting it to be the police. When Mark came home that evening, he was visibly shaken. "Did you hear about Sandra? It's awful. I can't believe something like this could happen here." Emily nodded, her throat tight. She could barely look at him, the guilt pressing down on her like a weight. Mark, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her, reached out to hold her. "Thank God you're safe," he whispered. It took everything Emily had not to burst into tears. Meanwhile, the police investigation had begun in earnest. Detective Laura Collins, a seasoned investigator with a sharp mind and a no-nonsense approach, was assigned to the case. From the outset, she knew this wasn't just a random act of violence. Sandra's murder had the hallmarks of something personal, something deeply rooted in emotion. The first step was to establish Sandra's last known contacts. Her phone records revealed a series of calls and messages exchanged with Michael, most of them filled with anger and accusations. It didn't take long for Detective Collins to piece together that something had been going on between them. The question was, what? Michael was brought in for questioning the next day. Emily's heart nearly stopped when she heard. She watched the clock anxiously, waiting for his call. Finally, her phone buzzed with a message. They questioned me. I stuck to our story. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. The police were digging, and it was only a matter of time before they uncovered the truth. Emily knew she had to keep her composure, but the constant fear was starting to wear her down. Over the next few days, the police interviewed everyone close to Sandra, including her friends, colleagues, and neighbors. The picture that emerged was one of a bitter divorce and a woman scorned. Sandra had been vocal about her suspicions of Michael's infidelity, but no one had taken her seriously. Now, with her dead, everyone was starting to pay attention. Then, a crucial piece of evidence emerged that shattered the fragile calm Emily had managed to maintain. Surveillance footage from a nearby gas station showed Michael's car driving towards Sandra's house on the night of the murder. Detective Collins now had a timeline placing him at the scene. When confronted with this, Michael faltered. His alibi was starting to crumble. Emily received a frantic call from him that night. "They know I was there, Emily. They have footage of my car. What are we going to do?" Her mind raced. She knew they had to think fast, but her thoughts were jumbled, clouded by fear. "Stick to the story," she urged. "We were together, remember." But it was clear that Michael was breaking under the pressure. He was no longer the confident, charismatic professor she had fallen for. He was a man desperate and terrified, and his desperation was making him unpredictable. The next morning, Detective Collins showed up at Emily's door. Her heart stopped as she saw the detective's calm, calculating eyes. "Mrs. Stevens, we'd like to ask you a few questions about Dr. Adler." Emily knew this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared for the icy fear that gripped her as she nodded and let the detective into her home. Emily felt the walls closing in as she sat across from Detective Collins, who fixed her with a piercing gaze. "Mrs. Stevens, were you aware of any tension between Dr. Adler and his ex-wife?" Emily's pulse raced. "No, I didn't know her well," she lied, trying to keep her voice steady. Detective Collins leaned forward. "Did you know he was with her the night she was killed?" Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "I don't know anything about that," she stammered. Collins studied her for a moment, then handed her a photograph. It was a still from the gas station surveillance footage showing Michael's car. This was taken just a mile from Sandra Adler's house, around midnight on the night of the murder. "He says he was with you." Emily's mind spun. She knew this was her chance to either save herself or sink with Michael. "Yes, he was with me," she said, her voice trembling. Collins raised an eyebrow. "So you're confirming his alibi?" Emily nodded, feeling the noose tighten around her neck. "We were at a diner that night." Collins sat back, expression inscrutable. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Stevens. We'll be in touch." As the door closed behind the detective, Emily's legs gave way beneath her. She knew the lie wouldn't hold. Michael was unraveling, and the police were closing in. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized they were running out of time. 2 days later, everything came crashing down. Michael was arrested at his home, charged with Sandra's murder. News of the arrest spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. Emily watched the television in horror as the footage of Michael being led away in handcuffs played over and over. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages, but she ignored them all, too paralyzed by fear to respond. Then, the bombshell dropped. Michael had confessed to the murder. Emily's blood ran cold as she watched his confession play out on the screen. Michael, pale and defeated, admitted to killing Sandra in a fit of rage. He claimed it was an accident, that he hadn't meant to hurt her, but the police weren't buying it. The details were damning. He described the argument, how he'd lost control, and how Emily had begged him to leave before they were caught. Emily knew what this meant. Michael had protected her, kept her name out of it. But for how long? Detective Collins showed up at her house the next morning with a warrant. "Mrs. Stevens, we have a few more questions," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. Emily's hands shook as she was led to the squad car. Her mind raced as they drove to the station. She could see it all slipping away. Her family, her life, everything she'd worked to protect. In the interrogation room, Collins laid out the evidence, the surveillance footage, the phone records, Michael's confession. "We know you were involved, Emily. You need to tell us your side of the story." Emily's eyes welled with tears. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. Collins nodded. "But you were there, weren't you? The dam broke." Emily confessed to everything. The affair, the confrontation, the murder. She told them how she had tried to stop Michael, how she'd panicked and helped cover up the crime out of fear and desperation. By the time she finished, she was sobbing uncontrollably. When it was over, Collins sighed. "Emily, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and being an accessory after the fact." The trial was swift and brutal. Michael was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Emily, having cooperated with the authorities, received a reduced sentence, 5 years for her role in the cover-up. Mark filed for divorce, taking the children and leaving Willow Creek behind. Emily's life, once so picture-perfect, lay in ruins. As she sat in her cell, she replayed the events of that fateful night over and over, wondering how she could have been so blind, so reckless. In the end, the passion that had once made her feel so alive had destroyed everything she held dear. Michael's rage, her desperation, and their reckless love affair had led to a senseless murder that tore apart 2 families and shattered a community.